Chapter 4. The First Clue. "Would you like to come and visit Leela, the little hunchback girl, after school today?" said Dad as David rushed hungrily into dinner, whirling his satchel by its straps, with Ragbag barking at his heels. "She's really getting over her illness now, and she'd like a visitor. No one ever comes to see her." "Oh, yes," said David. "I've only 2 more pictures to stick in the scrapbook I'm making for her. I'll do that after dinner, and I can go at 4 when I come home from school." His mother was singing as she mashed the potatoes, and David knew why she was especially happy. There had been a letter from Murray. He was 3rd in his class and had high hopes of getting into the 2nd squad on the football team. He had referred to the headmaster as Old Eagle Eye and was evidently quite at ease and happy. They all read the letter again at dinner, and David shivered with delight. Only another year, and he too would be scoring goals and calling the dean Old Eagle Eye. Then he remembered that England was a long way off, and he became thoughtful. He looked around at Mother, Dad, and Joan, and out of the window at the mimosa tree and the little bay where he played with Waffy. He pulled Ragbag's ears fondly. What would it all feel like and look like without him? He could not imagine. He hurried home after school, picked up the scrapbook he had made, and ran over to find Dad, who was seeing patients on his rounds. When David found him, Dad took him to the little girl, and he sat down, rather shyly, next to her bed. She was propped up with pillows and looked quite different than the dirty, crying child David had seen before. She was dressed in a clean white nightgown, and her hair had been washed and plaited in tidy, dark braids. She looked happy. "I've made you a book," said David. "I'll show you the pictures." Then he remembered she had been ill. "I hope you're better," he added politely. "Well, yes," said Leela, rather cautiously, "but I'm not well enough to go home yet." "You are the boy that brought me to the doctor, aren't you?" "Yes," answered David. "Well, then, tell your father I'm not well enough to go home yet. Tell him my back still hurts, and ask him to let me stay here a long, long time. Oh, I wish he'd let me stay here forever." David stared at her. "Do you like it in the hospital?" he asked in astonishment. "I always thought people wanted to get out of the hospital as soon as they could. Do you like being sick?" "I like being here," said Leela firmly. "I like the nice food, and the nurses are kind to me, and the bed is warm. Most of all, I like the songs we sing at night, and the stories we hear about that man called Jesus. Oh, I love that man called Jesus. I want to stay here till I know all about him. If only he was alive now, I'd go to him. He'd make me better." David hesitated. He did not quite know how to explain, but he felt that the little girl had missed something. "He is alive," he said after a little pause. "You can't see him like you could then, but you can still come to him. I know, because I came to him the other day." He spoke shyly and was hardly prepared for the way that Leela took the news. She caught hold of his sleeve, her eyes blazing with an almost unbelieving joy. "He's alive now?" she whispered. "I didn't understand. Tell me where he is. Where did you go to him, and what is he like? Oh, could I go too? Or do you think he'd come to me?" "It's not like that," said David, feeling rather out of his depth. "You don't have to go anywhere. He's near, beside us all the time. I just knelt down and prayed to him. When you do that, he can hear." "But I can't kneel down," said Leela anxiously. "I have to stay in bed." "It doesn't matter," answered David. "If you can't kneel down, you can just lie in bed and talk to him. If you loved him, it wouldn't matter so much about not belonging to anyone, and not having a father and mother. You'd belong to him. He'd love you and keep you safe. Ask the nurse to tell you. Look in the scrapbook. There's a picture about his coming alive after he died. He went to his friends, who were all so frightened, and showed them the wounds the men made when they killed him. And he told them, 'Don't be afraid. I'm alive.' Mother told me the story one night." "Show me," said Leela, nearly falling out of bed in her eagerness. David found the picture. She gazed long and earnestly at the figure with the lifted hands and at the kneeling, worshiping disciples. "Don't they look happy?" she said at last. "They're not frightened any longer, are they? But I wish he would turn around. Then I could see his face too." "I don't think anyone knows what his face looked like," said David. "You see, it was a long time ago. Here comes the nurse to take your temperature. I think I'd better go, but I'll come another day and tell you more." She opened her mouth to beg him to come back, but a thermometer was popped in, so she just smiled and waved. David sauntered across the compound yard. It was Friday. He had no homework. There would be time to run down to the bay before sunset. He did not want to go with Waffy. He just wanted to go alone with Ragbag, who had scampered up the path to meet him. His mind was full of thinking about Leela. If only she could understand about Jesus, her life would be quite different. Jesus would look after her and love her there in her village. She would not need to be lonely or unhappy ever again. He ran faster at the thought of it, bounding down the cliff from tuft to tuft and from rock to rock as lightly as a little goat, with Ragbag barking beside him. Just below stretched the sea, no longer shining and sparkling, but muted to a soft gray blue by the evening. He sang rather breathlessly, a chorus he knew as he leaped and skipped. "Wide, wide is the ocean, high as the heavens above. Deep, deep as the deepest sea is my Savior's love." Love seemed to be all around him, warming him and making him glad in the quiet of the sea under delicate colors of the sky. He looked across the bay to the headland where Leela's village nestled somewhere far back in those folded hills and valleys. She would be the only one who would know about the love that was all around each of them. He stopped skipping and jumping and sat down, leaning back against a rock, feeling sad for all the villages that had never heard, for Waffy, for the patients in the hospital who did not understand. "When I'm big, I shall come back and tell them," thought David to himself. "I shall be a missionary like Dad, and perhaps I'll go to those villages and tell them about Jesus." He began daydreaming, letting the warm sand slip idly through his fingers while staring out over the dusky sea. He was imagining himself tramping over the hills, a big, strong man like his father, healing the sick and preaching the gospel, afraid of nobody. He did not realize how dark it was becoming. Ragbag lay with his nose on his paws and his eyes half shut. It was such a still evening that even the ripples only trembled a little on the beach. Suddenly, Ragbag cocked an ear. His body stiffened. He raised his head and sniffed, and he gave a low growl. David, startled, took hold of his collar and looked around. 2 men were approaching, and they certainly had not come around the headland because he would have seen them, nor had they come down the hill behind because they were in front of him. They must have been hiding down behind the boulders, not far from where David was sitting. There we go. David rolled backward, falling behind the rock, and flung his arms around Ragbag's neck, imploring him to be quiet. The dog stopped growling, but his body remained tensed, as though he knew that these were not ordinary fishermen. David knew too, for they moved fast and purposefully, looking around furtively every few seconds. If it had not been twilight, and if he had not been so small, they certainly would have seen him. One of them leaped onto the rock that jutted out, dividing the sea from the creek where David and Wafi had found the little boat. When the man was astride the rock, the other passed him a long object wrapped in a cloth. The first man worked his way along the ridge and then leaned over the edge. And he came back and took another of those strange long objects. 3 or 4 times he came back, and each time he carried yet another one. Then he disappeared over the edge of the rock. There was silence. Ragbag's whole body was quivering with excitement and the strong conviction that something was going on at which he ought to be barking. But he knew by the presence of the loved hand on his collar that David did not want him to bark, so he kept still. The second man walked swiftly across to the far side of the bay, looked around the rocks, and came back. He looked up the cliff and all around him, but did not see David and Ragbag. Then, having made certain that the coast was clear, he too clung to the crest of the rock and pulled himself along, his bare toes clinging to the slippery crevices and the seaweed. Then he disappeared into the creek. In a moment later, there was the soft splash of oars, and the boat, like a little gray ghost, glided out into the open sea and disappeared into the dusk. I suppose they turned the engine on farther out, thought David. His teeth were chattering, and he felt very cold. He loosened his grasp on Ragbag and sat up. Everything was perfectly quiet again. So they started up the hill at a run and arrived panting at the top. As he reached the gate, he met Wafi, who had been looking for him. "Where have you been?" asked Wafi. "Why have you been running so fast?" "Down to the bay," gasped David. "I saw the little boat sail away. 2 men came with long things in sacks, and I hid behind a rock. I saw everything. They didn't turn the engine on. They rowed softly with oars." Wafi's face darkened. He was terribly jealous that David had this adventure alone, and at first pretended not to believe it. They started quarreling, and David suddenly turned away, shouting, "All right, I'll tell my father about it. He'll believe me." But Wafi, who really believed every word of it, ran after David and seized him. To get this into the hands of grown-ups was the last thing he wanted, and David's father was the worst sort of parent to know about it. David's parents cared about what he did and might ask questions. And David was always stupid enough to tell them the truth. They might even stop them from playing in the bay. Wafi felt sorry for David. He vastly preferred his own parents, who felt that what the eye didn't see, the heart could not grieve over. They would never waste time asking him questions. "David," he whispered hoarsely, "don't tell anyone at all. Not a soul. This is our secret, yours and mine. And we'll find out about it all by ourselves. Grown-ups will tell the police, and we won't even be allowed to play there again." David hesitated. He was not sure that he wanted to play there again, but on the other hand, it was a wonderful adventure, almost as good as a Hardy Brothers mystery. Murray would be green with envy when he heard about it. "Swear to me," said Waffy, his eyes very big and bright. "If you tell, you'll spoil all the fun. Promise, David, you won't tell." "All right," said David. He really preferred secrets and adventures that he could share with Mother at bedtime. But after all, there was nothing wrong in keeping it to themselves, and it did seem rather brave and manly to have a secret no grown-up in the world knew about. He turned away from Waffy and went home, chewing a nasturtium leaf thoughtfully. Perhaps he could talk to Dad about it in a general sort of way, without breaking his promise. "Dad," he said suddenly at the end of supper, "why do people go out in little boats at night?" "Fishing," said Dad, whose mind was on a patient with perforated appendix up in the hospital. "Most of the fishing's done at night. The fish can't see the net in the dark." "Well," said David carefully, "are you allowed to go out in little boats from the bay at the bottom?" It's unusual," said Dad. "It's too shallow around there for fish. But I suppose they might pull in. Darling, I shall be late, so don't wait up. Good night, Davy and Joan. You'll be asleep when I get in." He kissed them hastily and went off. David sipped his milk thoughtfully. "Mother," he said at last, "if you saw someone carrying long things to a boat when it was nearly dark, what would you think they were?" "Fishing rods, I suppose," said Mother, who was worrying because Dad had been working late so many nights lately. "Did you see some?" "Well, yes," said David cautiously, wondering how much further he could go and keep his promise. "Why would a little boat sail away, just rowing softly, when it had a proper motor?" So as not to scare the fish, I should think," said Mother. "Joan, stop licking your fingers and come and have your bath." David sighed and frowned over his mug. What one-track minds grown-ups had, and how dull they could be at times. He suddenly felt rather lonely and cross. He had risked his life that night and was guarding a tremendous, exciting secret which might be of national importance. And all anyone could think about was fish, fish, fish. If only he could tell them what had happened, how tremendously impressed they would be. If they would just get curious and ask some questions, he would have to tell them a little. "Mother," he said, following her into the bathroom where she was scrubbing Joan's knees, "just supposing little boats sail away without any lights. Why do you think a boat would sail away without light?" "Because of the sardines, I suppose," she answered. "Ugh, fish again," thought David.